Let me welcome you all to the last and final talk of our South Asia seminar for the fall semester. I'm Ashutosh Vashne, Director of Saxena Center. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Sharika Thiranagama. Sorry, I should know this better. I've been to Sri Lanka 15 times in my life. She was educated at St. John's, Cambridge, England, then University of Edinburgh, and has taught at Amsterdam New School, and for the last many years has been at Stanford, currently Associate Professor of Anthropology, could be full now. This is 2019.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, I don't update my CV.
Must be full now. And her work is based in Sri Lanka and in Kerala, South India. And in Sri Lanka, the book she is famous for, In My Mother's House, Civil War in Sri Lanka, published in 2011, dealt with political violence, home, displacement, militarization, family, particularly intergenerational and gendered relations in wartime and post-war life. And these themes were explored through the lives of Sri Lankan Tamils and Sri Lankan Muslim minorities, including Hill Country Tamils? No, Jaffna, basically.
Northern Tamils and Muslims.
Yeah. And her work in Kerala focuses on the contemporary agricultural Dalit laboring families, and I was just informed that that book is currently being reviewed by University of California Press, so perhaps it'll be out in a year and a half to two. She will speak to us on, here's the title. Title is Changed, In Search of Change, Everyday Life, Fear and Politics in Northern Sri Lanka. And the title is Change in part because of what happened in the recent elections, and especially as a fairly large number of Tamils and Muslims voted for ADK's party. So that is something she wants to explain. She wrote to me immediately that she would like to cover that what could have been seen. I've studied these things a little, not as much as she has. What could have been seen as something quite unexpected, actually. So with these words, let's welcome Sharika here, and she'll speak for 50 minutes or 55 minutes, and we'll open up for questions. Welcome.
Thank you. So I want to say thank you to Ashutosh and Natalia and Pavan for inviting me and doing all these things to make my trip possible. And as I was saying, I was here at Brown as a postdoc in the Pembroke Center 20 years ago. So there's a lot of things that are very different since 2005-06, since I came here. So it was nice to come here, and no worries about my name. I'm Tamil with a Sinhalese name. It was mispronounced every year of my life in Jaffna schools, where everyone said Thiranagama, which means something not very nice, actually. So I'm like well accustomed to variations of my name. Let me just get my phone so I can fulfill this promise to keep to 15 minutes. And maybe it'll be a little bit boring for some of the Sri Lankans in the room, because some of it will be very familiar to you guys, but I hope we can have an interesting discussion. So let me start, and this talk sort of draws from the work I've done, which is not in my book, but which is the work I've done post-war, Sri Lanka. So in 2011, I interviewed a recently retired Grama Sevaka, one of the most local of the municipal officers in a ward in Jaffna town, one of the formerly contested Tamil majority areas in northern Sri Lanka and considered the former heartland of Tamil nationalist movements. He reflected on the difference between the LTT, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Ulam, and their quasi-state and the now ever-present Sri Lankan security forces which were everywhere in Jaffna at the time. Everywhere I went, the security forces were there to remind Tamils of the thousands of Tamils killed at the end of the war in 2009. And when I asked him the difference between wartime and post-war provision, he turned to reflect on the differences between the LTT and the state. People obeyed the LTT unquestioningly, he told me. That was power, Sakti. Then he turned to indicate with a sweep of his hand the queue outside his office of people waiting to discuss rations. Now, he said, reflecting on the relief and rehabilitation resources that he manned, this is government, Jananayagam. Looking at me, he added another truth. These people, indicating the absent and ever-present Sri Lankan army, they are getting to like power too. End quote. He marked legitimate and illegitimate violence, reversing the order from how the state saw it while acknowledging their kinship. This was 2 years after the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War, which ended in May 2009 with the defeat of the Tamil guerrilla group, the LTT, by the Sri Lankan state. So just to give a little recap for those of you who don't know, Sri Lanka has a very basic bipartite divide of language between Sinhala and Tamil speakers. The majority community, around 74.5%, are Sinhalese. Tamil speakers are subdivided into different ethnic groups. So the largest Tamil-speaking minority who are central to the ethnic conflict are Sri Lankan Tamils, who were at one point approximately 11.9%. The second are Sri Lankan Muslims, 8.3% of the population. These are the two communities that I worked with. And there are many other minorities who speak Sinhalese, Tamil, or English, such as the Portuguese and Dutch burghers, the Vedas, Aboriginal peoples, and so on, but they were not involved in the ethnic conflict on grounds of language or ethnicity. And the other very significant minority are Malayaha Tamils, who are descendants of plantation labor bought by the British, resident in the hill country Tamils. And while they are not considered to be officially part of the conflict, in fact, many of those who were caught at the end of the war in the last battles were, in fact, Malayaha Tamils. And it's one of the hidden sort of aspects that people don't talk about, how many of those who were in the last battles were Malayaha and how many were, in fact, from Panjama Dalit communities, in fact, also. So while Tamils and Muslims are scattered all across the island, they're most densely concentrated in the northern and eastern provinces, the territorial basis of separatist claims to an independent Tamil homeland. Ethnic identities are far from primordial and have much more recent origins in the colonial state's codification of differentiation as ethnic difference. Now, the LTT, known as the Tigers, were one of the world's most successful guerrilla forces, famous for its extensive army, navy, and notorious suicide squads. At the time of its defeat, the LTT had maintained a quasi-state over nearly a third of the island. The military campaign to eliminate the LTT had begun into the newest version of the military campaign to eliminate the LTT in 2008, represented a new no-holds-barred strategy after 3 failed peace talks in 1990, 1995, and 2002. And from January 2009 onwards, the Sri Lankan army pushed the LTT from its strongholds into an ever-shrinking northeastern coastal strip. The LTT covered its retreat by forcing thousands of civilians to march with it. And the last month saw around 330,000 civilians under constant aerial bombardment from the Sri Lankan army. Now, while civilians were also being forcibly recruited and prevented from fleeing to government-controlled areas by the LTT, the large number of violence came from the state. It's absolutely undeniable. The state, in its state-bombed areas, it had declared no-fire zones. It extensively bombed hospitals. Every time the Red Cross gave it coordinates, it used them to bomb those places, and it illegally used cluster bombs. Despite controversies about this policy, the state insisted it was operating a zero-casualty policy and was mounting a humanitarian rescue of Tamils from the LTT. This is what we would now undoubtedly call a genocide. The last battles were highly public, reported almost daily in global newspapers and news channels for 3 months, and at the same time shrouded in secrecy as casualties piled up, but international agencies and journalists were banned from the war zone. It was described by the director of the International Red Cross as an unimaginable humanitarian catastrophe. The battles finally ended in May 2009 when civilians still remained trapped and the state captured and executed the LTT leader and most of the senior leadership. Allegations of gross human rights violations centered particularly on the months April to May 2009, when there's possibly around 50 to 60,000 civilians still trapped in this coastal strip. The British Channel 4 documentary Sri Lanka's Killing Fields screened highly disturbing mobile phone footage from soldiers with what looks like mass executions of bound and kneeling people and naked and violated dead bodies of Tamil women, among other violations. And probably more than 40,000 Tamil civilians may have died between January to May 2009, and actually the number of LTT cadres and Sri Lankan army soldiers who have died is largely unknown. The Sri Lankan state has always concealed how many army soldiers have actually died in the battles. So after the war was declared over, 285,000 Tamils from the war zone were interned by the state in squalid mass camps for security clearance and kept there for nearly a year. Thousands of Tamils also disappeared from the camps into detention with no notification to families of their return. And at the time, many of us observed that Sri Lanka had set a precedent for the idea, which is a precedent we see right now, with the help of new geopolitically important actors, that insurgencies can be crushed militarily rather than through peace talks, and the high human cost of lives could be recouped post facto. So my first book on Sri Lanka was on the life of the civil war, on Sri Lankan Tamil and Muslim minorities from the north, and I explored the ways in which militancy, political violence, and large-scale displacement became folded into intergenerational transmissions of memory and ethnic identification, and where I argued that the most profound effects of war and violence could only be understood on the impact on intimate and domestic life. Now, after the end of the Civil War, I began working on post-war Sri Lanka on 4 major themes of investigation. Firstly, the expansion and consolidation of military government in minority areas. Secondly, the current relationship between Tamils and Muslims resettling together after 20 years of ethnic polarization and displacement. And thirdly, the resurfacing of caste conflicts in northern Jaffna. And fourthly, the afterlife of political violence, where I look at the circulation of mythic stories about the LTT within Tamil public and private spheres, and a resuscitation of nostalgia for the LTT, given recent state violence. Now, and some of that is what I draw upon for the talk. At the same time, I also began long-term fieldwork in 2010 on the South Indian state of Kerala. And I was going to do work on the cultural life of communism in South Asia. As I thought of it, I thought there were maybe lots of similarities between the two. But soon inured to the hammer and sickles and no longer surprised by the familiarity and yet marked difference of Kerala's political culture, I diverted my interest into working on the legacies of enslavement and Dalit communities that featured so imperfectly as both the downtrodden for the Communist Party and yet not the subject. But when I did this work, it's when I came to rethink my work on Sri Lanka. As I came to discuss and explore everyday life in Dalit colonies, carry out household surveys, discuss work relationships, caste relationships, intercaste interaction, embedded notions of respect, I sort of realized that in many ways, all this time I'd been writing about violence and inequality in Sri Lanka, enormous amounts of violence, actually. But actually working in Kerala, in the rural countryside with Dalit communities, it was a kind of inequality, a stubborn, long, persistent inequality, minus the war and conflict, which is actually far beyond what I I could understand from Sri Lanka. I had to really re-understand it. And I understood, it came to me then in 2015-16, I realized that the Sri Lanka that I had done work on, with all its violence, trauma, profound displacement, loss of human life and infrastructure, I realized that that all came out of kind of egalitarianism and a leveling impulse that I hadn't seen until I went to South India. The violence I documented in Sri Lanka, civil war in the north and east, as well as 2 insurrections in southern Sri Lanka, all the convulsions of our last 50 years was a result of deeply leveling movements and impulses. Our deep violence comes out of Sri Lankans' desire for change, a turbulent and consistent force in post-colonial Sri Lanka that governs a restless and violent shifting of our histories and our homes. Now, this sense that Sri Lanka is in search of a change has become commonplace in the last 3 months, and especially over the last 2 years in the run-up to the elections in 2024. And in fact, the 2024 elections that have just happened the last 3 months were entirely run on this change message. And let me explain a little bit more. And there's nothing exciting or interesting about me saying change. Every single person for the last 3 months in the newspapers has been talking about a message for change. So for those of you who don't know, the recent Sri Lankan presidential election on September the 21st, 2024, brought the NPP's Anura Kumara Dissanayaka to power, AKD as he's called. And newspapers internationally were filled with descriptions of the Marxist president and his new prime ministerial appointee, a middle-class activist and academic, Harini Amarasuriya, who's an anthropologist, PhD of University of Edinburgh, like myself. We share a supervisor, actually. Firstly, how did a party which, while building its grassroots presence throughout the last decades, nonetheless, in the last election, the now president only got 3%. So how did this party become a party that has now got a 2/3 majority in parliament and where the president was elected so resoundingly? And the reason that it's an interesting question for so many of us is that the NPP, as a parliamentary party and coalition, is formed around a core party, the JVP, the Janata Vimukti Perumana. The JVP were formerly a Sinhalese insurrectionary group that was an alliance of largely rural students, youth, Buddhist monks that arose in 1971, only to be really brutally put down by the Sri Lankan state, a state which at the time was considered a leftist state. As the government changed hands and the civil war in the north became even more heightened, in the Indian government's intervention saw the entrance of the Indian peacekeeping force, or the Indian people killing force, as we call them in the north. And so not only did you see very brutal war being conducted between the IPKF and the LTT in northern and eastern Sri Lanka, in the south, the JVP re-emerged in a highly ethno-nationalist form, taking the state to task militarily for relinquishing sovereignty to the Indians, and by this token also Tamils, because in JVP, their thought and their writings, the Indians have long featured as the imperial force. I mean, they're not wrong about in India being an imperial force in Sri Lanka. The state brutally, but they are very ethno-nationalist and anti-minority in the 80s. So the state brutally repressed the JVP and arrested and killed thousands, including those thought to be associated with the JVP. And the JVP also disappeared and killed those associated with the state and those in leftist groups it saw as traitors. So some Sinhala leftists joined the state in paramilitary groups. Others went underground as both the JVP and the state were hunting down leftists and killing them. And so while war raged on in northern and eastern Sri Lanka, in southern Sri Lanka, around 60,000 people disappeared, feared dead between 1987 to 1989. The post-1990s period, which is this, saw all what I've described about the peace talks and the end of the war, saw also the slow return of the JVP to civilian parliamentary life. So they started again to retake over unions and a more traditional avenue of left organizing with a new emphasis on grassroots organizing across Sinhalese areas. So this is why over the last 20 years, the JVP has made itself into a parliamentary formation, the NPP, with this grassroots operation, only partly reconstituted from its insurrectionary days. And it actually appeals to all these middle-class Sri Lankans, which it never did in the 80s or the 70s. But it has always consistently supported whichever government in power proposed hard action and war against the northern and eastern states, because it has a very strong commitment to unitary and sovereign majoritarian state, in fact. So that's some of the history of the JVP. It's both new and not new to everyone who's Sri Lankan too. So the real leap for the JVP came in capitalizing on the anger of ordinary Sri Lankans after the 2022 economic collapse. Now, so Sri Lanka's immensely successful welfare state system of free education, free healthcare, and subsidized basic essentials has been the ingredient of success for Sri Lankans despite our crippling civil war. In 2022, Sri Lankans came in and out of the view of the international media because of this economic collapse. The government in power in 2022 was a ruling party constructed around a family of brothers who were directly responsible for war crimes in 2009. So the president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, in 2009 was a prime minister in 2022, and the defense secretary, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, in 2009 was now the president in 2022, and there were many brothers in power. And in 2009, these brothers ran on a campaign called Vistas of Prosperity and Splendor, which by March 2022, people were pillorying as vistas of loot and plunder. The economy had been running on ever-increasing amounts of debt since the end of the civil war in 2009, so there's like a chronic economic mismanagement. There's massive financial debt for ever more infrastructural projects, while actually the welfare state was being depleted all the time. And you saw the massive expansion of the defense budget after the end of the war rather than the decrease. And this massive debt, the lavish sort of infrastructure projects, some of them were useful, like roads were very useful, but others were unused airports, port developments, a whole set of white elephants that came along with contracts and kickbacks. So new monuments, shrines, statues were constantly unveiled, and Sri Lankan nationalism got even more kind of glittery, more flashy, more life-size statues of the Buddha, more ugly as well, a lot of really bad aesthetic choices made. All of this was accompanied by repeated anti-Muslim riots as well, which picked up after 2009 through political encouragement and support for radical Buddhist orders. It also saw the continuing marginalization of minority Tamils and the failure to demilitarize or return Tamil and Muslim land, especially Tamil land in the north and north central area, which was taken as high security zones during the war for military use. And there was no accountability for the hundreds disappeared throughout the war and immediately after. Now, this precarious balance of economic debt and display and state violence was tested when the pandemic happened, because revenues from tourism and remittances dropped dramatically, and they had been masking this kind of very indebted economy. So by February 2022, the foreign reserves had been drawn on so extensively there was not enough left to pay the constant debt. And this was a tipping point for the economy. Once dollars ran out, a food and fuel crisis hit. The protests in 2022 became known as Aragalaya, which I say it in a very Tamil way, so the emphasis should be the other way. The protests in 2022 were initiated by people who were waiting in hours in queues for gas canisters to cook and for fuel for vehicles, including the small three-wheeler tuk-tuks that many depend on for transportation. Food prices in 2022 rose 40% just before the protests. And if you really want to understand what economic collapse looks like in Sri Lanka, it's about the fact that people are starving. That there is just no way for most families to be able to eat 3 meals a day. or even in the one meal they have sufficient quantity or quality, which is not something that even through war Sri Lankans were ready to accept prior to this. And so this is what initiated the protests in 2022 when people came out in most towns. And the most prominent protest site was in central Colombo at Golface Green in Colombo. When Colombo was still a shabby genteel city, Golface Green was an open space on Colombo Beach, which was considered a public space. Fringed by posh hotels, even when it became ever more posh, still families went to fly kites, walk by the beach, and enjoy congregating. Marginalized from these public pleasures as Colombo grew more and more exclusive, nonetheless, after March 2022, the protests reclaimed this space for libraries, food tents, speeches, debates, and songs. And, these protests brought together thousands from very different ideological backgrounds and for very different reasons, but in very consequential ways. Now, everybody was suffering, and the economic collapse united all Sri Lankans in its devastation. People shared the same circumstances of rising food prices, scarcity of fuel, and rolling power cuts. At the same time, there's a history of divided experience in Sri Lanka, where minorities have very different experiences of Sri Lanka's politicians, dividends of big projects, law enforcement and militarization, job creation, and just have a greater fear and insecurity in relation to Sinhalese communities and the state. In the initial days of the protest, if I had been there, a lot of Tamils were very frightened to go out in the streets when lots of Sinhalese people are marching slogans. It's not an easy thing to immediately contemplate. The protests were for the main from the Sinhalese community, though Muslims and Malayaha Tamils participated very visibly and vocally in actuality. So you saw that, for example, while there was the Muslim protesters from communities who had suffered immensely in the last few years, the protests came in the middle of Ramadan, so they broke their fast collectively at the protest. They provided food for non-Muslim protesters without any reprisal. Eid was celebrated in the protest too. For the first time, there was a very small group, a very small collection of protesters in Golface commemorated the deaths of thousands of Tamils in the last battle of the Civil War. This is Father Jivanta Peris, who led that commemoration. Hill country Tamil communities came to protest as well. They have this very long tradition of strong workers' protests, so they brought that along with all these Hindu rituals, which they performed actually, exorcisms and rituals in the protest too. Right? Sri Lankan Tamils, it was very mixed. Nationalist messages in minority Tamil areas were mixed. Some were very bitter that these protests on a very large scale had not happened actually when lots of Tamils were being killed. And so that these were built on a kind of determined ignorance of anti-minority violence. On other footing, some Tamil nationalist groups actively discouraged Sri Lankan Tamils from joining, though actually many people did think about joining. And also lots of people were afraid to join because being a Tamil or a Muslim means you're targeted by the state and security forces in a different way from Sinhalese. So when you have still 189 Muslims still incarcerated for trumped-up charges after the Easter bombings, it's no mean thing to go out on the streets as Tamils and Muslims. So they were both there, but it was also complex and differently attenuated. But, the protests were also attended by clergy from all of Sri Lanka's religious communities. So Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus. The Catholics were very prominent. Catholic nuns came frequently to protect protesters from the police. They stayed up all night. They stood in between the police and the protesters. So what does this mean? The most striking thing about the protests were that there was no violence against minorities in the protests. It didn't mean that there weren't Sri Lankan flags floated or there weren't, in fact, also demobilized soldier camps. It wasn't by any means that this was somehow some kind of minority-loving, anti-racist space. But there wasn't violence against minorities. And people kept on asking me, because I went on all these radios to try and explain the economic collapse in California. So why isn't there any violence against minorities in the protests? And I had the same reason. It's not because suddenly protesters weren't violent and suddenly they had turned into minority-loving anti-racists. I mean, that's just not true. The divisions in Sri Lanka are deep. The histories of violence and racism are long, they're intimate, and they're everyday. But what I replied always that it wasn't because it wasn't that there was no violence because there's no racism. That is not the case. It was because the state wasn't involved. For once, the state was being protested against. Now, I don't know if you could say the same is true in India at all. I wouldn't say that. But in Sri Lanka, the fact that there wasn't communal violence in 2022 made it clear how highly organized violence against minorities is in Sri Lanka. It's been fostered, though ordinary people often carry it out, it's largely fostered and organized and made possible by the state, the active involvement of law enforcement and military security personnel, radical Buddhist monks and lay leaders. Whenever we saw the big anti-Muslim riots like in Thingaba, there was actually state security forces involved and monks involved. So without active organization, as we saw in many of the riots that happened in Sri Lankan history, even in 1983, the mobs came with electoral registers, right? We see ongoing racism, everyday miscommunications, tensions, inequalities, but we don't see large-scale collective violence because this tells us that action, organization, state sponsorship of violence is actually the major ingredient for anti-minority violence. When you take the state out of the equation, you actually you see a lot of racism, but you don't necessarily see organized forms of violence. So these protests culminated in the resignation of Mahinda and Gotabaya Rajapaksa. I had to cut out all the slides that showed people joyously swimming in the presidential palace. My favorite one is people eating snacks and having a cup of tea in the kitchens and cleaning up afterwards, as Sri Lankans apparently tend to do. Lots of people playing cards and carom as well. So I limited myself just to this picture. But the Rajapaksas were replaced by a former opposition politician, Ranil Wickremesinghe, whose many failed previous premierships had culminated in losing his electoral seats. And he was only in power actually because he was on the proportional representative electoral list. He hadn't even been elected popularly in the previous election. He then became president, brokered a very stupid deal with the IMF, actually a very high, very, very restrictive one, even more restrictive than the IMF normally does in levels of public spending, postponed local elections, fearing his own unpopularity, and he was in charge of quite a lot of repression, arrests of student leaders since the end of 2022 in the name of stability and order. It was this situation that saw presidential elections in September and parliamentary elections in November 2022 when the AKD came roaring into power. Right. So here is what it looked like in parliamentary elections. And you can see it's quite evenly distributed. It's an overwhelming victory.
This is presidential.
This is a presidential, sorry.
That's fine.
Yeah, in the September. And so AKD, this is the red. You can see they're not getting votes from the north and east in the same way at all. And the NPP, while it was quite slow to incorporate itself into the Aragalai, it actually did soon come to represent itself as representing the anger of the people against the established elite. They promised an end to politics as usual. They ran primarily an anti-corruption message, mobilizing a new middle class who deeply desired change, and an older left nostalgia which identified them as a party of the people. Right? So one way, this is easy to understand why it was like this. You could see the message of change, and then you could also say, but the minorities weren't biting with a party associated with kind of singular nationalism. This is 2 months later, the parliamentary elections, where they are getting votes up and down in minority areas. If you look at that 2 months later, the NPP is elected also from the north, a little less from the east. And, so I want to explain that. I want to say, though, that for most of us, the most amazing spectacle of the election is that I would say nearly 80% of Sri Lanka's older politicians were voted out. Most of the established parties were decimated. I think I spent the whole night looking at all these out things. Everybody I know was very joyous about it because I'm a bit like that, I'm analyzing the AKD, but I'm like that meme, who's your most woke friend? I wouldn't have supported the NPP. I went for a very, very small left party across ethnicity, which didn't get very many votes. So I'm only doing analysis here. I'm not, it's not about an endorsement. But regardless, though I went for this small party which made no headway, what was really amazing was seeing this, that Sri Lankans went to the polls and they just took away most of the political establishment. And there's no other election, I think globally, that has done that. It's deserving of attention, actually. But now let me just turn back to the puzzle of the NPP being elected from minority areas. So in these 2 short months between September and November, Tamils and Muslims turned down to vote for the NPP. Why? Okay, so there's one very clear answer. Tamils and Muslims are pragmatic voters. The Tamil nationalist parties were in complete disarray, and voters had warned them that they were sick of them and that they were dissatisfied with Tamil politics and politicians. And I pulled out 2 districts that I know in Jaffna, just because that's Jaffna town and that's Nallur, which I know, which are close. And if you look at them, it's very clear. It's not that they're getting huge amounts of votes. In fact, that's one of the highest, 40. In most districts, I looked at every district by district, it's about 30, 20, 30, 40. But they win on that because there are just so many, the splintering is enormous. There's so many other Tamil parties that are competing. People split their votes. And it shows really 2 things. One of them is that Tamil Eelam, which all of these multiple, I'm talking about 50, 60 parties, all said they were doing, has lost its force to distinctively mark your politics. In fact, because of this splintering, the NPP was a stable vote. It was able to win because it was a consolidated, stable vote. And also that, one video from BBC Tamil, which was interviewing young people, it's in Tamil, that's why I didn't show it. It doesn't have subtitles. So many young people basically saying, they don't care about it. They said, all these politicians come and tell us Tamil Desiyam, this 13th Amendment. They talk to us about that, but they haven't done anything. We want to try something else. Right? So there is a kind of failure of Tamil nationalism, which was quite critical. And part of it was really the failure also of Tamil politicians to do ordinary politics, which people really wanted. They wanted roads, they wanted jobs, they wanted these kind of things, and they'd been cut out of a political circuit for a very long time. So in this way, it was like, okay, let's give the NPP a chance. It's not a resounding vote, but will they bring something to us? So I'm going to start again to explain that sentiment. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to start again with the story of Sri Lanka and what it means to look for change for the 4 minorities. So there are 3 very important...
This is literally the first time that primarily Southern Party has won Northern votes, so it has happened before also.
It's the first time the parliamentary party, but in presidential elections in 96, Chandrika Bandanaka Kumaratunga
ended up winning.
Yeah, and very overwhelmingly in the north. At the time, she was very, very popular actually in the north. So sometimes the newspapers forget some of these things because they don't look at the history of it. But in parliamentary terms, it's the first time you see this kind of win. So let me try and explain a little bit deeper than what a newspaper can tell you. So there are 3 really important considerations to understand. And one of them is the basic contradiction that constitutes the Sri Lankan state, which is the interlocking of a mono-ethnic nation within a multi-ethnic state, a post-colonial political formation deeply marked by its former colonial state. Secondly, the effects of militarization and ethnic polarization on the lived reality of rather heterogeneous communities that has resulted as a consequence and not the cause of ethnic conflict and war. And thirdly, and more recently, the economic crisis, which toppled the Rajapaksas, who came to power through their persecution of the war, and the expansion of militarization, the making of national security as the motive force of the state for at least a decade before Aragalaya in 2022. So I just talked about the third. So now I'm just going to talk about the first two things and how they connect to this more recent third. So Sri Lanka's post-colonial history is dominated by a populist politics that brought into being a complex universal welfare state providing free education, healthcare, and other benefits for its multi-ethnic population, which at the same time was undergirded by strong singular nationalist rhetoric that privileged the ideal beneficiaries to be the majority community. So a very characteristic name is there was a Sinhala Only Act, which there was riots. After that, the Sinhala Only Act was amended to Sinhala Only and Tamil also, which is a very good way of describing the Sri Lankan state. A series of anti-minority legislations was imbricated within this welfare state, including the proliferation of violence. So anti-Tamil riots in 1958, 1971, 1977, and 1983, which increased in their severity and impact, and the failure of Tamil political parties to combat discrimination led more climactically to the formation of multiple Tamil militant groups in the 70s and the rise of the LTT, which became supreme in the 1986 by absorbing and eliminating other militant groups. And the LTT continually legitimated itself by pointing to the violence of the Sri Lankan state and saying that its existence was necessary because Tamils could never live safely under Sinhala majoritarianism. And the combat between the LTT and the state turned into what most Tamils describe as fully fledged war from about the late 80s onwards. Now, to understand what that war, those areas looked like, you have to understand that the northern and eastern provinces was a patchwork of gray zones of sovereignty. So the LTT had its taxation and own taxation structure, including over consumer goods and targeted taxes like the National Defense Fund. It built a Tamil Eelam police force, judiciary, prisons, orphanages, right down to its own bus service in the Vanni region. And it also had a very elaborate set of rituals around their own agency and the burial of the dead. However, the LTT never adopted general welfarist policies, and the Sri Lankan state never conceded the welfarist aspects of its institutional reach. So the LTT state actually remained parasitic on the Sri Lankan state. The Sri Lankan state continued to pay the salaries of all government servants, teachers, doctors, municipal workers in all areas, including those not under its control. The LTT never took over the services of the state, and its welfare functions were limited to ensuring that those rewarded were linked to the LTT itself. And so if you want the peculiarity of this interlocking welfare state is understood if, for example, the Sri Lankan government bombed northern districts extensively through the 80s and 90s, and it even bombed its own government offices, which is why I don't have a birth certificate, because it bombed its own Kacheri building. At the same time, this heavy and indiscriminate bombing in the north, at the same time as this bombing, the Sri Lankan state also sent rations regularly by ship to refugees that it itself was creating. Here, the Sri Lankan state, on one hand, treated its citizens as enemies to be eliminated willy-nilly. On the other hand, by virtue of these enemy people being simultaneously citizens of the multi-ethnic state of Sri Lanka, the government was bound to provide welfare and basic state functions and was expected to do so much. And so this kind of attachment to Sri Lanka's welfare state is, however, it's actually strongly part of how ordinary Sri Lankans, both from the minority and majority community, understand their own lives and biographies. A state that, Sri Lanka's free healthcare, education, subsidized water are these kind of critical elements, even as the state has invested less and less in the public sector. And that's what I mean by this kind of mono-ethnic nation, this singular nation, but a multi-ethnic state where the state still continues to provide all these services, and people are attached to them. I didn't realize how attached I was to the welfare state until things went really bad in 2022. But this is only one picture. This is one picture of the state sovereignty. The other one is the way in which, since the 1970s, every detail of the state, the nation, its understanding of masses, especially its minority and majority, as well as the ordinary experience of people, is about militarization, because Sri Lanka is a deeply militarized state and society. So historically, the party political machine was the most significant arbiter and dispenser of the state provision, and the army used to be a subordinate to the president as commander-in-chief. But since the 70s, because of the repression actually of the GBP and also counterinsurgency campaigns against Tamils at large and a conventional war against the LTT, you just saw an enormous expansion and transformation of the state security forces over 1970. And you can see this in the 70s when not only does the army get bigger, but also a new paramilitary force of the police, the Special Task Force, STF, is also accompanied by the license of state forces to extensively detain, torture, including rape, and kill those it suspects of being terrorists, often outside of the system of formal prisons. So, and for Tamils, this means that you get caught between the violence of the LTT and the massive violence of the state security forces on the other hand. So what you really see is this kind of northern and eastern areas over 30 years, you saw an expansion of the coercive state structures. The Sri Lankan state symbolized in a new way by its army, and then the LTT quasi-state dominated by its military structures. Now, this expansion of militarization is tied to an ongoing reproduction. So Sri Lanka has one of the highest rates of disappeared in the world. In 2021, it was the second highest. Now, the significance of the figures of disappeared is the density, length, and the continuing reproduction of disappearances. And that's because since the 1970s, you have new kinds of spaces and procedures which are not new anymore. They've been going for a long time, which constitute a kind of life in what I call the gray zone. So in the 70s, prisoners used to actually be tortured in prisons, but they were kept in the prison system. You knew where they were. They were right there in the prison system. But at the same time, they soon became actually tortured and kept in army and police camps where nobody knew where they were. And so after these 70s, prisoners began disappearing into a shadowy world of in-between army and police camps, secret floors of the intelligence headquarters, unidentified bodies were dumped. This is where the STF also expanded onwards. And so to this day, the Sri Lankan security forces are known for very specific torture techniques, and released detainees report extensive torture. And it all happens out of the visibility of the official prison, which are also terrible and overcrammed, but primarily with people for very minor drug offenses. So this is the kind of history that our violence has created, enormous uncertainty, trauma, and it's propelled so many lives left behind into frozen times, but it's also a really organized form of violence, in fact. Our disappearances are organized. If Sri Lanka in 1948 imagined its legacy as a newly independent country, but built it already as a mono-ethnic nation, even as it inherited a multi-ethnic state, then 50 years later in the 1970s, Sri Lanka was busy beginning its career as a militarized state that would wield violence in ever more organized chaos. And the LTT, far from challenging this, emulated this in areas under its territory. It also brought a very strongly militarized and coercive caste structures to areas under its control, with its own judiciaries, police forces, intelligence services, and torture camps as well. Thus, in truly Benjaminian form, struggles over sovereignty in Sri Lanka, were very manifestly about the capacity to wield and perform stateness through violence, and reveal the ways in which authority was founded on violence. For both the state and for both the LTT and the Sri Lankan state, the difficult task of substantializing the nation, the people in any clear fashion, was resolved in wartime by militarizing it. So for the state, the singular Buddhist nation congealed into the Sri Lankan army, understood as ordinary soldiers and a newly glorified corporal body. for the LTT, an elaborate and complex system of martyrology around LTT cadres. And as I said, this is a very interlocking embrace. So the LTT state depended on the violence of the Sri Lankan state and said, okay, but you have to live under your own. And the Sri Lankan state legitimated its own extrajudicial state killings and murders and disappearances and violence through the need to combat a dangerous enemy, the LTT. Now, the other side of the reproduction of the violence, militarization, is the commercialization of militarization. So since the end of the war in Sri Lanka, rather than demilitarizing Sri Lanka, we've seen an expansion of the army and state security forces in everyday life. The army now runs businesses, restaurants, tourist resorts, beaches, and airlines. It commercially develops formerly civilian areas as high security zones, as well as land grabs. And in fact, soldiers are used to carry out routine municipal work in Sri Lanka, in southern Sri Lanka. But in the north, in north central and northern areas, there's still very much a military force. So what does this actually look like in northern Jaffna in the end of the war? Now, I didn't work in the Vanni regions, which were the former battlefields in Jaffna, but it's actually worse in the Vanni region. But after a year of internment by the state, 285,000 Tamils began to return to now destroyed homes all across the northern Sri Lanka in 2010, and many of them went to Jaffna, the densely populated Jaffna Peninsula. And there were these two major post-war landscapes that these returnees were embedded in. First was landscapes of return and resettlement. So the municipal structures were continually engaged with issues around rehabilitation, meager resources, reinstatement of basic municipal functions. And life was very, very precarious, and many survived by borrowing money and depending on members of families working abroad. The most contentious thing is land titles, because not only did people not have deeds anymore, many were squatting on government land. They couldn't prove ownership. The LTT had granted land, but the government refused to recognize any title granted in LTT years. And so what you saw actually was that there's both a re-establishment of community structures and residents in Jaffna, but also all kinds of new instabilities and uncertainties. And the second landscape was the constant presence of the Sri Lankan state, as I said, through the army, the police, the paramilitary STF, as well as the Navy, the Air Force as well. So around 60 to 70% of the army is stationed in the northern province. And it means that this is a low figure, some organizations say it's higher. At a certain point, there was about one security personnel for every 5 civilians in Jaffna, which is higher than many other places when you have active insurgency. And you only really saw languages of solidarity between Tamils and Muslims when you saw it in relation to the army. Oh, you can't see this, what a pity. So this insurance advert, which came up in 2010, which we respect you for who you are. And what you saw after 2010 is that all these banks and insurance companies rushed into places that were formerly war zones, and people you saw these were like new markets, in fact, for financial instruments. So people were signing up to credit cards with huge rates of interest. In fact, so you had massive indebtedness at the end of the war because these were all new potential areas of economic expansion for the financial sector. So you really saw also like massive new kinds of debt in the north and east that you hadn't seen to the same extent before. And people started joking that before they were afraid of the army and the LTT, now they're really afraid of the banks coming to collect their debt instead. And on more than one occasion, people talked about, what we really want is another Cargill's. So Cargill's is a big supermarket because we want jobs, we want roads. So what you saw in the north is you had years and years of war, which meant that a really ethnically differentiated economy anyway. There was very little work, very little stability. And then now you had the new kinds of economic instability too, which the collapse, in fact, came to catalyze. So minority Tamils and Muslims across the former war zones were not only vulnerable as others across Sri Lanka to economic collapse, they also knew that far from an ordinary situation, this was produced by their distance from the state, a state that they don't like, but a state that their lives have come to depend on. So then to get back to this question of, so why might Tamils then choose to make the pragmatic choice to not only vote for a Sinhalese party, but a formerly ethno-nationalist one like the NPP, I started thinking about another moment at the end of the war. In 2010, when the Sri Lankan state, under a lot of international pressure, appointed a Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission in May 2010. So it's called the LLRC, and it was regarded by most people as a farce that was just appointed to assuage calls for reconciliation, but without any mandate to do so. It was very heavily criticized, so I'm not going to go into all the criticisms, but there are like a few that the UN panel of experts pointed out. One, the LLRC mandate was set up not to assess accountability, but to assess the issue of the Sri Lankan state quote, failure to protect its citizens from terrorism, end quote. Two, the LLRC was understaffed. It only had 20 functioning staff. Three, at least 3 members of the commission's impartiality was compromised because they'd been senior figures of the Sri Lankan state in the period they were supposed to be examining. 4, it only had 1 Tamil and 1 Muslim commissioner, and the 1 Tamil member was also the only woman on the commission. So it's a double token. And 5, the LRC had no provisions for witness protection. And in many cases of testimony, Sri Lankan military personnel and government officials sat unchallenged through sensitive testimony, sometimes taking photographs of those who were testifying. And 6, the LLRC allowed hours of testimony for witnesses in Colombo and only on average 15 minutes each for testimony from Tamils in the former war areas. So there's loads of criticisms of the LSA. I mean, this gives you a sense of how much of a farce it was. So it was a real farce. People thought it was. That was not the surprising thing. The surprising thing was there was a farce, and yet when they went to war-affected areas, Tamils and Muslims turned up in their hundreds and thousands to give testimony. Most of them were turned away, actually. And I was like, why are people turning up to give testimony to what we all know to be a farce, actually? That was a real puzzle. Why would they come there? Given all of this, given that the soldiers are sitting there looking at them. In every sitting of the LLRC in northern war-affected areas, Tamils came with lists of very concrete grievances against the army, police, and government. So witness 1 from North Central Vavuniya began by asking for, quote, a unified political solution that all people will be able to live with respect in this country, end quote. It is not easy to forget things, he said, especially 30 years of suffering and grievances. Witness 2 asked for a permanent solution for the Tamil people. And both of them followed their request for permanent solutions by the lack of improvement in their living standards, buyout of land. They were followed by innumerable witnesses detailing missing family members and asking for any information. So when you look at, I looked at all the testimonies from different areas, and the majority of the testimonies concerned, 1, requests for information about missing family members detained by the government, and the majority of the witnesses were women. 2, questions of resettlement and the lack of provisions for resettlement, detention in refugee camps, lack of access to family in other camps. 3, complaints about the police, CID, Sri Lankan army. 4, ongoing restrictions due to emergency laws. Now, there's very little in what people testified that had anything to do with reconciliation. Instead, it became very clear from these testimonies that however flawed the LRC, many Tamils pursued it as an opportunity to enter into a conversation with the state about the restoration of state functions. So as one man from Chetikulam, Vavuniya testified, quote, in order to have change in the whole country, an individual must first change in his own heart. That becomes transformed into a change in society and finally in the whole country. There are many things that the government has to do to make this a reality. And the people also have a duty to make the government act in such a way that there will be the required goodwill and trend of real progress in this country. So when I looked at all these testimonies, what was really clear was that Tamils did not come to be included in the nation. They really didn't care about being part of a national imaginary at all. What they wanted was to be included in the state. So at the time when I wrote about it first, I said, okay, this commission is a state performance, and it's the way that the state tried to re-establish its sovereignty in an area where the LTT had been active by showing that it was both like a super arbiter because it established this commission. It's the primary actor in both being violent and also a welfarist. And it tried to do that by actually re-establishing itself in a very muddy situation. But those who turned up to share their testimony really didn't care about that at all. They had very little expectations of justice. That was not what they talked about. They lived in deeply militarized areas. They wanted a place that they could transact directly with the state because they were in very, very difficult circumstances at the end of the war. And it wasn't an ideological one. It was reliance on the welfare state. That is how I actually see the vote of November 2024, in fact. There are very little likelihood that Tamils and Muslims are going to forget the violence that's been done to them. They're in very vulnerable positions, though. And Tamil politicians simply haven't delivered. They've been really focusing on the Tamil nation, and that's not unpopular among Tamils at all. Tamil nationalism is quite popular, but the politicians haven't brought them close to the ruling coalitions and pork barrel politics that would bring jobs, improvements, development, roads, not only for the army and tourists, but for them. So with a great deal of cynicism and a deep desire for change, Tamils and Muslims too have tossed themselves into the let's give these people a chance feeling that pervades the country. Now, once again, this is where the LLRC is instructive, and this is a question for both Sri Lanka and also Bangladesh, actually. A mandate for big transformation hasn't come with an inquiry into the bloated army or the role of the military. At all in Sri Lankan life. So actually in 2011, the LLRC report really surprised many of us because sometimes the commissioners were sleeping through the thing. So none of us thought they actually were listening, but they actually wrote a 407-page report, which was very, very exhaustive. And they actually recommended that there were land issues, resettlement, disappearances, grievances. They concluded that Tamil minorities had genuine grievances that had shaped the civil war, and the state had to undertake effective redress by speeding up identification of the disappeared, allowing families access to detained, making fairer provisions for resettlement, and acknowledging that the internal displacement was more long-standing than 2009 alone. They recommended that language policies be actually implemented, and there should be all kinds. So it was actually pretty good. I mean, none of it was implemented, not one bit of it. But the real problem, however, with the report was that it let the army off the hook. Basically, all the recommendations said that the Sri Lankan state and army made the best decision at the time to protect the rights of civilians, and that they didn't listen to any of the evidence given by the war affected, and they weren't allowed actually to even visit the war zones by the government. So they took the evidence given to them by the government, and they said, yes, there have been more deaths than the government said there will be, but it said that essentially the state could not be held to the same standards as the LTT because it was acting in the defense of its citizens, and that, the state should curb militarization to enable, quote, perception management. So the army remained in place, which actually allowed successive regimes to use national security as the reason to win an election. And so really, that's how I want to conclude. I'm sorry, I really have taken a long time. But if you think about this mono-ethnic nation and the multi-ethnic state that I've outlined, such a state has entwined welfare and violence, and successive governments have won on these, actually. Now, once framed as war, the kind of violence of the state has kind of floated free from that periodization, and it's kind of become this dispersed, ambiguous, and everywhere feeling. That's what it feels like to have post-war violence. In the post-war period, the expansion of the army shows that militarization and securitization, rather than being the result of desires for security, have in fact produced desires for security. So fear of continual menaces and this idea of national security that has to be guarded all the time is not a problem addressed by securitization, but enacted by it. Fear searching for an object is the feeling produced by decades of militarization. Now, this highly differentiated economic and ethnic geography is marked by a promise which is always producing itself through this disappointment. And no Sinhalese politician in 2024 made a statement about curbing the role of the army or the military, actually. I mean, yes, some did, but really you cannot see by any means that this, even what SJB acknowledged, is being addressed. This is not how the election was won. Now, what is government? Now, it is both the army and the police in Sri Lanka, but it's also a desire for ordinary political practice in Sri Lanka, which brings jobs, roles, economic benefits to different regions and districts in Sri Lanka, which is produced through connections to the state. A state which is always partly presented through the army, yes, which is this difficult terrain that minorities in Sri Lanka have to live through, but it's also a promise of welfare, subsidies, general well-being, which motivates all electoral practice across Sri Lanka. And in this case, it seems that the welfare state as a kind of site of attachment and a place of economic sort of well-being is what is perhaps won this election in the time of a rather crippling sense of insecurity. But it doesn't mean by any means that ignoring the role of the army or the militarization will solve any of this, because that is the other side of the state, and it is a very, very big side of the state. And so when minorities make a pragmatic choice, they're always thinking about both of these things at the same time. So change isn't new in Sri Lanka. It's a historical structure by which ordinary people in Sri Lanka shape their aspirations. It's a constant horizon of possibility without a determined context as such. It circulates within the parameters that our historical structures has given. It allows for newness, but it never means freedom from our past. It is this desire, circulation, and demand to be accountable to the past and what Sri Lankans hold dear, which, the new government in Sri Lanka will have to address in its turn. Okay, thank you. So sorry that I went on for so long.
Not at all. We have.
Shall I leave out this picture with the Sri Lanka's trusted by every Sri Lankan? Oh no, I think it's turned off. Okay.
So tell me if I'm wrong, the argument about why large numbers of Tamils and Muslims voted for AKD's party, for NPP, is that the state can be viewed as having two sides. The security side, which is highly oppressive, and the welfare side, or the everyday functioning of the state, the health, the education, the benefits, the roads, and without a connection with the state, what you're calling multi-ethnic state and mono-ethnic nation, without a connection, a clear connection with that state, these everyday benefits will not be available.
I mean, yes, and
therefore, this is a story. There should be a story in many areas of insurgency, actually. So it's not a vote just about the nature about the character of the nation, that the new government will represent. It's a vote about the everyday functioning of the state, what might be called quotidian state. Quotidian state as opposed to ideological state. This is a vote for a greater connection with the quotidian state. It's not a vote at all on the ideological side. Am I getting it right?
I mean, yeah, I think this. So the point about the state in its two phases, the welfarist and the violence, is not. I don't claim it to be a very original point. I think it's been kind of well written about in most places, that the state has these phases which are not two different phases, but in fact are imbricated together. So that, I think, is
certainly in states that have seen insurgency, inner wars, right? Civil wars.
I think most states, it can be argued in one way or another, have this kind of...
Before 1945, yes, most states. But after 1945, you will have to say the state has gone through it, in a global sense, quite a bit of change. But wherever inner wars have broken out, civil wars have broken out, insurgencies are broken out, you have the military plays a role which is highly oppressive, and the security forces, especially for the minorities. But I don't think you can say that the West European state on the whole, or American state on the whole, after 1965 has used. There's a return to that now to some extent, but post 1965 American state, after the passing of the voting laws and the return of vote to blacks and the return of civil rights to blacks after 1965, you can say the police forces were used certainly in American South even after the Civil War, let's say after 1875, roughly through 1965, for 90 years. Right. So I think, and European state, wherever inner wars have broken out, for example, Spain, right, this would be a real issue. The security versus welfare. But anyway, let's forget the state as a whole.
The European
but the Sri Lankan state.
I would compare it more to India.
Huh?
I would compare less to the European state and compare.
India in Kashmir is very different from India in.
Yeah, it's a colony.
In several Indian Bengal, or India in Indian Kashmir. Indian Kashmir would look like what you're describing.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
And I think let's see what Subed has to say. It would look like what you're describing. India,
but also
India
different.
India in Andhra Pradesh, India in Tamil Nadu, India in Kerala, India in certainly Gujarat would be different, but that would be a very different kind of. India and Kashmir would look like this.
Let me distinguish it in a couple of ways.
Yeah.
Though I think we're talking description, maybe. I mean, the argument I'm making is quite banal. I agree, but.
No, it's not banal.
But it is.
It's a profound distinction. You're applying it to, which we've seen in some other places, which you're showing how it works in Sri Lanka.
I think so.
We did not know that.
But one comparison you can make, which is quite interesting, is between Sri Lanka and Colombia, which are both the only really places where you see large parts of a kind of, quote, nation state, which are outside of the control at certain points of the official state. And yet there's this dual kind of both, like really out of its control, and at the same time you have the state provision happening. So it's actually quite unique what happened in Sri Lanka with the North and East. You really do only see that in Colombia, where it really doesn't have control of large parts of the North. You had to go through LTT border police if you were going to go through to the headquarters, right? So that is not comparable to many other places. The way I think it's a little different from Kashmir is that Kashmir had its own independent entity prior to the Indian state imposing itself on it, and it's a very well-established, long historical sense of its own entity. That is much more unclear in Sri Lanka. So there's both so people have a relationship to both the Sri Lankan kind of as an area as well as a minoritized identity. So if you look at in 1983, why were so many Tamils killed and displaced in the South is because polarization, ethnic polarization, happened as a consequence of the war rather than pre-existing. Lots of Tamils actually did live in the South, for example. Malaya had Tamils where lots of the riots happened are in the hill country areas. Sri Lankan Muslims, which are such a significant minority in North and East, are also interrupt this idea of a kind of clearly ethnically only Tamil North and East. So it's a more complicated terrain in that sense too. What I'm describing is by no means necessarily a liking for the state as the Sri Lankan state, but a sort of very deep kind of Sri Lankan belief since the 1950s in the efficacy of welfare, which is quite unparalleled. I don't think India has a lot of pro-poor legislation, but if you compare Sri Lankan sort of welfare provisions, the reason it has such high social indicators despite having such a crippling war is because it has one of the most welfarist arenas. And so these things kind of coexist. On the Sri Lankan state, as a state, when I say it, I actually always think about the military. But at the same time, the kind of schools and teachers and the municipalities and the hospitals and so on is also the state, but that's not necessarily the way that people think about it. But it's something that people actually do have this very long-running attachment to.
So the welfare state political economy scholarship does recognize that at low levels of income, a developed welfare state or very significant welfare state is hard to develop. Sri Lanka is an exception in that literature. It is. And incidentally, China under Mao also was an exception. At very low level of income, very highly developed welfare state. And in Kerala it happened. It didn't happen in India as a whole. In Kerala it did happen. And Patrick Heller is not here, who studied these things in great detail. But Sri Lanka was a very shining exception for welfare state established at low level of income. No doubt about that. The other, incidentally, which we don't discuss anymore, was Lebanon.
Yeah.
Very high levels of literacy, very high levels of health. On the human development indicators, Lebanon was very, very high. And some of the earlier literature does talk about it. And another example that is taken in that early literature is Malaysia and Sri Lanka. And Malaysia, of course, is now almost a first world country. It's that rich. But that was not true in the 1960s. And there are these examples from Malaysia and Sri Lanka. But anyway, the point is that I'm not saying that you like the Sri Lankan state. That's not the implication I'm drawing. I'm saying that the state, at least in Sri Lanka and in Kashmir, Indonesia and East Timor, and in Papua, Spain certainly in an earlier time, where you have these civil wars, the welfare side and the security side both coexist. If a welfare state has already come into place. And this is a vote, you're explaining it. I'm not saying you like, it's not clear to me that there's a normative implication. You're explaining it that the vote is for better roads, return of welfare provisions in a much more stable and secure way. Right or not?
It's, actually there are quite good roads going out to North, mainly because of all the military, actually. And tourism. But there's been very little actual trickle-down economic provision that people have felt themselves in terms of in jobs. And so in a very, very pragmatic level, that's what, like I said, I was like, wow, we've gone through 30 years of war, and I have all these young people telling me they want a new supermarket in the area that we've got. I mean, so, but you have to reckon with the fact that for lots of people, they are indebted. There's lots of remittances. And if I take the North, which I know better than many other parts of the North and East, you can see the composition of the peninsula has changed a lot. So because of the war and the way that, on one hand, this historic migration out of the North, but the war really accelerated migration. And so on one hand, this kind of migration opened up the possibilities for a much wider range of people leaving the North than there was before. So you had a big asylum diaspora where all kinds of people were able to leave. I'm not saying that in a good way. I mean, they left under very traumatic circumstances, but you see a huge Tamil diaspora develop. And a lot of people go abroad. At the same time, largely that is a little cross-structured. So the Jaffna Peninsula, which used to be very heavy percentages of the dominant caste, is now no longer predominantly dominant caste at all. The demography of it has changed quite a bit because those who went abroad were disproportionately from the dominant caste. So you see, so even the peninsula as it is, in terms of who's vulnerable to economic provision, a lot of people are relying on remittances, but that's going to dry up. So, and many of them are not many, but a quite significant number are not from upper caste backgrounds. So there is also all these new caste conflicts that are occurring precisely because resettlement means that a lot of mingling that happened in refugee camps is now, as people are resettling, it becomes a big issue. Again, a lot of mixed caste marriages that happened during the war because one way of avoiding LTT recruitment is they didn't recruit if you were married. People married very young, they married quickly. And then now many of these marriages are also, the divorce rates in Jaffna are very high actually. So there are all these things that are happening, which means that this kind of message of Tamil nationalism backed by politicians who don't really do routine provision is what people are sick of. So part of it is not necessarily an embrace of the NPP and the state, but it's a disgust with politicians who are not offering these routine welfare provisions, which in Sri Lanka are extremely important for these reasons. And the reason it's a shining example is because they have been very effective. That's why we have very high literacy, but they've always had an ethno-nationalist tinge to them. So every big welfare provision in Sri Lanka has had these unexpected outcomes. So the Sinhala-only policy in 1956, it's a really huge, it's proper Swabhasha, unlike in India, right? So in Sri Lanka, you have universities and schools in English, Tamil, and Sinhala, right? So this kind of Swabhasha legislation was really important in Sri Lanka because it had one of the most concentrated Anglophone elites prior to independence. It's Tamil and Muslim and Sinhala elites all went to the same school. They all spoke English and so on. So it really meant something to do 1956 Sinhala only. That's how my father is the first in his village to go to university. He's that generation. That's how he went to. He's the first in his family and village. And that's because, in fact, he benefited from this Sinhala only education. Now, what that meant was it was also an anti-Tamil thing, but it also meant that you had Tamil-only education in the North and East too. So very indirectly, a whole set of youth who entered Tamil militancy also came from the indirect effects of a Tamil-only education as well. The Sri Lankan, the discriminatory university thing that in the 70s, they standardized, there were riots about that. They standardized university admissions so there's a very progressive element to it. On one hand, the state said it had to be district by district, not across the country, which meant that it disrupted the urban the kind of the same old schools getting their children into university. Every district children had to get from the top marks. Now, that's a progressive policy. It undergirded that by saying that it was harder to get into university within the Tamil language medium than the Sinhala language medium. So you have one hand, but it's always tilted against the other. So it's harder then for Tamils to get in. Now, the indirect effect of that in the North and East is that more people in the Tamil medium from the East were able to go to university. In the past, the North had dominated it. So you see all these kinds of ripple, when you actually look really detailed at this. In some ways, you can see that also the state produced Tamil insurgency, not through its intentions, but both by its incredibly anti-minority legislation, but also by a state that produced Tamil-speaking youth distributed across different regions. I mean, so these are the kind of paradoxes that we lead with, and the welfare and the violence of the state was always there in the way that it is with states which are built on violence. Fundamentally, I do believe in Walter Benjamin's point; it's with force, but from the 70s onwards, you just see this expansion, which is really, really unprecedented. And that is what keeps the reproduction going, which is these gray zone areas. Like I said, its disappearances are about not being in the official prison system. Most of Sri Lanka's violence is done just in camps, in police cells, not officially anywhere. And so that is both, I think, a mundane thing you can say about any state, but it's historically in Sri Lanka, what has got us to where we are is that historic. Does that make sense?
So let's open up. Suved has his hand up. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. Really, Ashu mentioned already, my name is Suved. I teach in the history department and I work on Kashmir. So while you were speaking, there was so much going on in my mind and I have so many questions. I won't ask so many, I'll just ask a couple. Also because Sri Lanka has been on my mind for the past couple of weeks. I teach a class called History Through Film, and one of the weeks we do on the Tamil genocide. So we watched No Fire Zone a couple of weeks ago in class. And Luke here made a presentation about the LTT actually just yesterday. So many questions, but I just wanted to ask three. One, you mentioned the JVP, and it began as some kind of leftist rural movement, also participated by monks.
Some.
And you mentioned that it was put down by a state which considered itself leftist. I was just curious, how does that work? If you want to sort of elaborate on that a little bit, which also speaks to basically.
Are you talking about the first insurrection or second?
First in 71.
First one, yeah. Because it also speaks to the hold of the nationalist consensus about how they want to preserve the state. So even potentially revolutionary ideology comes in the service of nations to sort of suppress whatever is challenging the state. My second question was, you talked about how LTT never became welfarist, and the Sri Lankan state was still paying the salaries. I was thinking about the pull between being a resistance movement and being a state, and arguably the fall of LTT at the end was because it was a bit too organized. I don't know if you had thoughts about that. And you mentioned about the militarization in the north, where 60 to 70% of army lies, which is again very familiar. I just wanted to get a sense of when does that start happening and how is the situation today? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so many questions. I have to go backwards through them. I think many of the figures that come out, and these are all informal figures because people are trying to calculate them and they're not official figures. So some of these about how many personnel are stationed in the north really come after the end of the war, because that's when we can tell. And because up until then, as I said, like north and east is a very tangled net of sovereignty so some areas were explicitly LTT and state, and some areas were officially state but covertly LTT as well. And then there's a whole part of the north central area, which is where many of the final battles came, which were very firmly LTT controlled. So it's these were just the concentrations of military actors basically in the north and east is very high in terms of the LTT had all its brigades, but it's still a small number compared to the state and all its various forces, which were also included the Navy as well, who are responsible for all kinds of atrocities in the coastline areas as well. So it's
LTT apparently was the only insurgent organization which had a navy of its own. Others have had air force. An army, of course, is very common, right? When an insurgent force, but it managed to get naval ships.
Oh yeah, and
yes, I'm just saying that.
And commercial shipping as well, and commercial shipping too. The sea pigeons were also commercial. It had commercial. I mean, this is like the paradoxes of Sri Lanka that Sri Lankan official food products like MD and so on and so forth became enormously profitable and distributed because LTT networks were shipping them for its diaspora. So like in London, you can buy all the Sri Lankan garment goods of all the jams we love, the MD jam. I mean, and so the government food producers actually got a huge fillip from the LTT commercial business, commercial side of it. Anyway, that's a very Sri Lankan kind of thing that that we're all eating. And people would discuss this. Oh yeah, when you go and you buy these jams, no, you should get MD. MD is the best one, though it is actually the sweetest. So there's this idea that it's higher quality if it comes from the more official brands, even if they're the state you oppose. But with the LTT and how organized it was, I think it's a very complicated argument because part of the ways in which people look at militancy is that they tend to only see the LTT. And there were many, many different militant organizations in operation in the 80s, of which you had really 5 big ones. Of the 5 big ones, the LTT was the smallest but the most militarily organized. So it was the only one that didn't really do consciousness raising. So the other ones like Plot and Tello and so on, they had Indian branches and Sri Lankan branches. They also did consciousness raising. So they had people in villages and so on. So they were very, very huge affairs. So of them, the LTT, as people said, its strength and its weakness was that it was extremely organized, extremely militarily defined command structure. So all the militant organizations did purging, but the LTT was very disciplined and liked by many for its discipline, in fact. So it never pretended to be anything more than a very strongly military actor, where some of the other groups would say they were leftist, the most leftist, and who was one called EPR left, but they ended up allying with the Indians, so that really tarnished their reputation. But the LTT wasn't one of the leftist ones. It was very nationalist, very military, and that is how it was able to prescribe all the others. And, it was also, and it kind of eliminated a lot of Tamil leftists too. It was very strongly about land, nation, and so on. So in some ways, it was a very successful military actor as well. But in 2009, the state was very ruthless, and Sri Lanka did set a precedent that we see now in Palestine, which is that you can just do this, nobody will stop you. And even though they were like, international, maybe you shouldn't do that. In fact, there was a green light from India, a green light from US, and so on. It's like, just go ahead, do it, and then deal with it afterwards. And that was a very, very dangerous precedent that we do see repeated. Whether the LTT's failure that many people think is that it thought itself omniscient. It didn't think it could be toppled. And in fact, there were, even in February, all these bishops went to its headquarters, the Catholic bishops said, you have to campaign for a ceasefire. You have to go for peace talks, because nobody else thought it was as omnipotent as it did itself. And so maybe it was because it had this sense of military strength that it didn't see that they had been really weakened by splitting into northern and eastern factions. The eastern faction was working with the Sri Lankan state, providing new information. Militarily, it was declining quite a bit. That aside, all I care about is that thousands and thousands of Tamils were killed and displaced. I mean, that was what it was all about for me those months. And that lots of the young LTT cadre who were killed were forcibly recruited to
the estimate
do so.
of 40,000 killed between January and May of 2009, that comes from where?
The figures are very disputed.
Yeah.
So people, according to the Sri Lankan state, just 10,000 in total, everybody. And some Tamil...
10,000 would be a lot in 6 months, but 40,000 is an enormous number.
So some Tamil organizations suggest it's like 90,000. I pick 40,000 because that's for the UN panel of experts in 2011, their report. And that's, and it's a very, very exhaustive report. So that's the number I go with. And that's a conservative amount. It's very hard. The reason it's very hard to know is because the government service figures for numbers in districts in Sri Lanka, however much you have in a district is how much stuff you get from the state. So no number is ever what it is. It's always inflated, every district population figure. So we don't have very good ideas, but we are pretty sure about the 330, and 285,000 were detained. And so the 40,000 is a conservative amount from the UN. That's how I pick it. But there are people who do go much higher than that, they would say.
And JVP in the state, the first insurrection, is it a leftist insurrection? It's an ethno-nationalist insurrection? What is it?
It's both. The left has no problem in being ethno-nationalist when it needs to be. It's a kind of Guerrist. Well, in 71, so I think across the world in the 1970s, you see all kinds of youth insurrections and insurgencies. And Sri Lanka is very much part of a kind of Latin American and South and Southeast Asian sort of affluence. And in this, the love of Che Guevara is very, very high. And the former leader, Rohan, of the JVP used to actually dress a little bit like Che Guevara too. And it's much more of so it's produced by the Marxist-Maoist, the Soviet Maoist split. So the other really consequential thing, of course, across South Asia and Southeast Asia is in the 60s when everything splits between the Soviet and the Peking branch. Right. End of things, right? So that happens to the Communist Party in Sri Lanka too, though Sri Lanka in the government at the time very famously were these Trotskyites, because Sri Lanka has the longest running Trotskyite parties in the world. They're very small now. They used to be much bigger, and they were in power in the 70s. So that was supposed to be this kind of progressive leftist government, Srimama Bandaranaike, with the Trotskyites in power with it, austerity measures were there, but it was import-export. We were going to produce our own economies, our own things. It's a very, very strongly leftist message. But many of these young people, so the monks and so on, it's not so much significant that they're monks, but that they were from this rural, particular new sector of young people who had become educated in Sinhala through this Swabhasha education. So there were this new wave of young people who were well-educated but underemployed, who had very radical ideas and leftist ideas, and who were interested in that, but mostly felt that armed struggle was one way to get the revolution too. And then they were incarcerated in very, very large numbers. Around 100,000 were forcibly re-educated, as it was called by the state.
Were they explicitly anti-Tamil?
I think this is a very difficult question because I have a person. A lot of people would say no, they were not. But if you look at the JVP 5 lessons, there was always a really strongly anti-Indian, but then that stretched into anti-Tamil. One of their 5 lessons is about the Indian imperialist forces, which, as I said, not wrong on the imperialism part, but the way it was kind of extenuated to understand minorities in Sri Lanka as also, so Muslims and Tamils as part of a
Indian imperialist designs.
or oppressor class. They were then positioned, so minorities were positioned as oppressor class. I think it's a bit complicated because that wasn't as prominent as it was in the 80s. In the 80s, it's very violently ethno-nationalist, but it wasn't as prominent in the 70s. The 70s is much more homegrown about the desire for change in Sri Lanka. But if you ask somebody like my father who left the GBP in '69 over the ethnic question, he would say, it was there from the very beginning. I didn't like their policies on Tamils. I left them then, but that's from a very insider perspective in that sense. But I think it's not straightforward then. But you can see that just, Sri Lanka has had these insurgencies on all sides. And it is, I think, because of this deep desire for change.
Why would the monks join?
I mean, why not?
No. You perhaps know it instinctively. It's the idea that monks are joining a leftist flare-up or an organization or leftist insurgency. You have Catholics in Latin America, some of they tend towards leftism, but a leftist insurrection which has Buddhist monks joining in is not very obviously comprehensible. Not obviously, right?
I mean, I wish there were more of them, but unfortunately, most of the monks we have are the ones who want to, kill terrorists and wish death to the minorities. So, I mean, Sri Lankan Buddhist monks are capable of having every political opinion under the sun, and many of them are deeply violent towards minorities. So that's always been the question I've been asked, because everyone wants to think of Buddhism and its spiritual elements, which I'm not saying is not there, but it's a national, it's a majoritarian religion in Sri Lanka, and it comes with all of that. I mean, those of us who think about Hindutva also can say that. So it is more surprising. I agree with you that there were all these leftist monks precisely because much of the monks that we see now are so much aligned around a kind of ethno-nationalist picture where they feel that they are upholding the state religion and against Christians and against violations to the national they nominate themselves. And because there's such a long history in Sri Lanka of national sovereignty and not national, that's rubbish, of sovereignty and Buddhism as going hand in hand in terms of the idea that there's a kind of an interlocking embrace between the king and the Sangha, that these are things that are the righteous order of Sri Lanka, which has become ever more reinforced more recently. And you see the state is the army. There's all these new pilgrimages sites in Sri Lanka. Lots of new Buddhist areas built, some of them on Muslim and Hindu areas as well. So lots of appropriation for that, but new big pilgrimage sites.
But Hindutva is very anti-leftist. It defines both would qualify for the concept of religious nationalism or ethno-nationalism merged with religion. That is true. But Hindutva is very seriously anti-leftist.
Yes, I don't think that Sri Lankan Buddhist monks are particularly left. I mean, like I said, I'm like that meme of your too woke friend. I would like the JVP to be leftist, and then I don't find them in their incarnation that leftist, but that's their history. I think when you think of those young monks who were involved in 71, it's more significant that they're young rural youth, and that those young rural youth can be monks, and they also can be university students, and they can be many other things. It didn't have that as a feature, but it's more that these were all of a certain generation.
Was the state also considering itself leftist?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so we are the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. It's, so there's a lot of enough nostalgia around that. It is a strong inheritance.
So there is a Nehruvian era in Sri Lanka as well.
No, more akin to Mrs. Gandhi, actually.
Yeah, less Nehruvian.
More akin to Mrs. Gandhi's leftism, right?
I don't know if it's Mrs. Gandhi's leftism. I think it's pretty left, like socialist, Yuri Gagarin plant a tree.
Mrs. Gandhi
We're going to host the non-aligned movement several times, kind of thing. It's more explicitly, it always was more explicitly than India, by far, much more explicitly into that. But it's the 70s where that changed, where you have a rightward alignment with the UNP, which is aligned with the US much more so, in fact. So.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Hello, sorry. So I do work in Bangladesh with caste marginal Hindu minority communities there. So I feel like there's a lot in this talk that was like very relevant and interesting to me. And I wanted to ask about something that you mentioned very early on. With, I think your language was the stubborn, persistent inequality of caste in Kerala, and the comparison of that with what you saw as a more egalitarianism in Sri Lanka. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more, and also talk about kind of the politics and context of caste. Because I feel like I see something that is interesting in my work is that I feel like there's more opportunities in kind of Hindu minority communities in Bangladesh, for example, to have like caste marginal caste autonomy than perhaps what I've like seen in the Indian context. So yeah, if you could talk about that a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think I think caste in Sri Lanka is remarkably understudied and under-talked about, but ever present. It's what I actually want to go back, and my next work is going to be on caste in northern Sri Lanka, precisely because I learned so much in South India, and I learned so much in Kerala working with Dalit communities that I had to ask myself. I had written a bit about caste in Sri Lanka prior to that, but I had to also question myself and ask, well, why haven't I written more? What is it about me? Why? And so I think that for me, that was eye-opening in terms of really challenging and pushing me to look back at Sri Lanka, and where I had dealt with caste a little bit, but say, but how would it be to actually properly talk about caste in North and East? And it was becoming really pressing because post-war there have been so many caste conflicts and disputes. I would say one of the biggest contrasts. So when I teach about Sri Lanka, when I do like an undergraduate lecture on caste, so Sri Lanka is always the example of how you can have caste structures without Brahmins, in fact. Right, so Brahmins are really negligent in Sri Lanka. They're like a very small service caste. They are not a dominant upper caste in that sense. And so what you have is both among Sinhalese and Tamil communities, you have a very large landowning or peasant caste, so Goigamas in the south and Vellalas in the north, and in the east it's a little bit more complicated. But it's so complicated I can't quite describe it. And the other big difference is, well, there are three. So the second big difference is that unlike in India, where you have the large majority of Indians are from OBC and Dalit castes, even though we don't have to have a census to know that around 85% are probably not upper caste, just like the Bihar caste census shows us that upper castes are a minority in India. That is very clear. In large number, they dominate, and they're a minority. In Sri Lanka, you have an invert. You have very large numbers of those who fit into these big voluminous categories of the dominant castes. So you don't have that same like small minority upper caste. you have large numbers of dominant castes. And some of them in southern Sri Lanka, because of the way that the colonial state didn't see Sri Lanka as a place of caste, so it had all these other policies than it did in India. You have in the southern Sri Lanka, you have all of these other castes becoming quite powerful, actually. So the cinnamon peeling caste, so there are other castes which maybe historically were considered lowered that became dominant through the colonial economy. And in the north, what happened was not that other castes came up, but that lots of castes became Vellala, they became dominant. So you have these different patterns. Now, the third thing is in India, in South India, everybody would tell me what caste they were. They were like, yes, I am this person is that. People were just, and if you're from Sri Lanka, nobody talks about it. You all know, but you don't know. At the same time, you're not supposed to talk about caste in this explicit way, and yet it is also there. So if you grow up in the north, when people ask you where you're from and you tell them which village, then they ask you which road you're from, then they are trying to figure out where do you fall? Is it on this side, which is mainly this area? So it's this very deeply embedded knowledge around very segregated areas, and it's about residential areas and certain kinds of occupations. And it's this guessing game. So people won't say explicitly. You just have to know. And that's what's made it very difficult at the same time. So you have all of these accounts of Sri Lanka, which is mainly about ethnicity, which is very obvious. But caste is this kind of ever-present thing that you know without knowing, and you have to know to understand what is to be known, if that makes sense. So it has proved quite stubborn and difficult for people to properly analyze and discuss. But as I said, the war really threw that open. It both provided all these new kinds of leveling impulses, because the militant groups themselves said that anybody could join. The LTT also said it was anti-caste as well. So they had these new diasporas. At the same time, it was still structured. Most of the diaspora is upper caste. You see large numbers of Dalits in Tamil diaspora in non-preferred, non-English speaking destinations. So France, Norway, Switzerland have higher proportions of Dalit communities in the diaspora than Canada, London. So there's all these little ways in which it plays out. But I sort of knew it, but I didn't know. This is what I actually want to look at when I start doing it again, because there's so much that happened, for example, with certain professions like hairdressers and so on, which became unionized, and the toddy taverns also, and then the LTT also played a role. So you see this professionalization of occupations in the north, and I think Sri Lanka is sort of ripe for that in a way that is what is quite implicit, but what is very strongly there. And India, for me, just presented this case of where everyone wanted to talk about it all the time. It was out there to be talked about, and it taught me something. That's more or less.
The next question. Luke.
Hello.
Hey.
My question is about caste as well. I have two questions actually. You showed the most recent parliamentary election results, and you showed all the different Tamil parties. Is that splintering caste related? And is the reason for upcountry Tamils siding with the government in a lot of different arrangements of the government also caste related, despite them being affected by the 1983 riots?
So I think the splintering, I think, is not as explicitly caste related as it is the fact that all the Tamil politicians keep on falling out with each other. And then there's multiple groups. But there is definitely a refusal by many of these parties to deal with caste. at all. So people will say, like, when I started saying the word Dalit in Jaffna, I was like, oh, you spent too much time in India. So that was like we don't say Dalit here. And I was like, well, you don't say Dalit, maybe somebody else does. But then people would say things to me like, oh, it'll only divide us as a nation if we start using the word Dalit. And anyway, it's more common in the north to say Panjama. But I just enjoy like provoking these reactions by refusing to follow. But most of the Tamil nationalist parties are very bad at dealing with caste, and the one that was very prominent before, in fact, explicitly refused to deal with it at all. So it's this ongoing internal splinter. With the hill country Tamils, this plays out in their experiences in the north. So many of them many hill country Tamils came into LTT areas from some of them were granted government land in the 70s when the government did land reform. But many came in the 80s because the LTT actually gave them title to land, for example. So lots of people settled in LTT areas. But if you ask them, they will tell you all the time that the Jaffna Tamils, those from the north, treat them very badly on caste grounds. It's this ongoing issue and thorn for them in relation to other Tamils, that they are perceived as being of lower caste by Sri Lankan Tamils. And as for how they side with the state, that I think is more complicated. It has to do with the history of Malayaha Tamil politicians and parties and their unions. And they have always gone in and out of coalition with state parties. So that is more complicated. But you're absolutely right that caste completely contours that relation. And it's the underside of the Tamil nation, in fact.
And I had one more question, going off of what you said, how you have that inside perspective. I want to ask you this. So I've only learned about the JVP ideology post 1971 and how India's involvement in quelling the insurrection with Mrs. Gandhi maybe informed the anti-India perspective and, like you said, eventually the anti-Tamil perspective. But I don't know much about the ideology prior to 1971 because you kind of insinuated that it shifts a bit. So is there anything that you could say about that?
I mean, so it's quite part, as I said, of a sort of this general split between the Soviet and the Maoist ends. And really, Maoism was much more popular among South and Southeast Asia than the Soviet, and in the end, because these are largely peasant agrarian societies. And what Maoism says is that you're a peasant and you can make change in your society. You don't have to wait to be a urban proletariat in order to get, so it's very popular actually, and in Sri Lanka too. So there is this sense in which you can have these rural non-elite coalitions that actually can transform society. But it is also very much about the romance of of other groups and other kinds of movements, particularly in Latin America and Che Guevara, and this idea that, you have that you can train yourself, and certain kinds of books proliferate around that. And so you could say that they in some senses, they were a very, very, before 71, they were kind of mostly an organization with all kinds of different things going on but mainly leftist. It became the lines of the organization, I think, post-71 and in the 80s became much more clearly an organization rather than a loose coalition that took in lots and lots of young people in the late 60s and early 70s who wanted to change things and do things and felt frustrated. And in Sri Lanka, anyway, you can see that less now, but certainly in the 60s and 70s, because of the non-aligned movement, it's really so many things were translated from Russian and Chinese into Sinhala and Tamil. So there's so many books and pamphlets and things that are floating around that are very much part of how lots of ordinary Sri Lankans would think of themselves. And same is true in the Tamil areas too, as well. So, when I was a child, my father subscribed to Sputnik for my sister and I, which got delivered to, like Jaffna from the official Soviet Union's children's magazine. And we were getting Sputnik, and he gave us the little red book, and all of these things. That's not an uncommon, I think, set of like a larger pool that has changed quite a bit. But I think you could say that about a lot of South Asia too.
Last question.
Hi, Jen.
I wanted to ask.
No, she can hear you, but people at the back also should hear.
I just wanted to ask about the gray zone that you mentioned, and also like a second question. Maybe we don't have time for that. Just about the gray zone, like if you could talk more about what that means in terms of your research, and also like if it's like something that is established historically as a concept.
I mean, of course, like all of us, no idea is original. So I'm sure, Primo Levi talks about, the life in the gray zone. I mean, there are many ways in which one could use it, actually. And I just use it just very specifically as a term for one specific set of infrastructures. I think a larger usage of it would be what most of us writing and thinking and from Sri Lanka come from, which is when you write about the war, is that there's no hands that are clean in Sri Lanka. And that's not how you can approach or think about war, militancy, or so on. Every family has a connection or not. So, I mean, of course, there are ways in which you could talk about it. Like Sri Lanka as a whole, from the south and the north and so on. So it's, on one hand, I think the international media is so surprised that the JVP are in power, but I don't know if I'm that surprised. I'm surprised about the voting, but I'm not surprised because that is Sri Lanka. I mean, that's very possible that people are going to, that you might end up as a politician having come from an insurrectionary group. That's a perfectly legitimate, viable strategy in Sri Lanka. What I mean by the gray zone is mainly because I read, whenever I was thinking about, and there's a lot of work on disappearances in Sri Lanka, and there's a lot of writing about disappearances too. And it's just very moving and very emotional. And there's, of course, a lot written about the families that disappeared. And I started just thinking about it because I wanted to talk about how the structures of that are reproduced. Because disappearances are such a huge feature of Sri Lanka, not just now, but they have been for so long. Part of it is, I think it's useful and important to think of it as a set of structures and spaces rather than as a phenomenon. It's something that becomes reproduced again and again and again. And why is that? It's because there are these spaces. And it means that unless you dismantle these spaces, these extrajudicial spaces, which are as much part of the state as the official spaces of incarceration, that nothing much will be done. So for me, it's a useful way of talking about what I feel is actually going on. You can, until you say that you have to close down these shadowy army camps and the police camps. And the same was true of the LTT's traitor prisons too. Unless you actually shut down those spaces, which is where people live their life in the gray zone, is then what it means to be disappeared is so many things. It could mean that you're in one of these spaces. It could mean that you're dead. It could mean that you're not dead. It could mean that somewhere along the line you weren't given a number that allowed you to appear in the system. So of the people who disappeared right after the war in the refugee camps and so on, the only people who've been really tracked down were the ones that accidentally the ICRC gave a number to as they got onto a bus. Just to be visible can sometimes be the difference between surviving. And we don't know how long people survive, whether they die within a year or 2 years, or whether they're kept for a really long time. So I wanted to think about that part of it as well, not only disappearances in their everyday emotional value, but why is it that Sri Lanka has this for so long? And if you do that, you can see it starts in the 70s. In fact, and of course, as a Sri Lankan person, it's because I know that because my father was disappeared in the 70s for a couple of years. So I know that it starts around that time and that it's a new thing then, but it becomes steadily less and less new after that. And I think it's important to make clear historical, political analysis of these things, because I want there to be something better for Sri Lanka. So I like to actually say there's a structure to this. We can do something about that. There's a reason why we're here. It's not just because we're a post-colonial country with lots of violence and trauma and so on, but there are these things that happen. So anyway, that's a long answer to a very short and once again quite banal point that I am making.
Time to bring this to a close. This is our last talk in the series. We'll see you all in February now, and the schedule is more or less ready. Will be announced soon, but we end this semester with sincere and grateful thanks to Sharika.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being very patient with my very long talk. Thank you so much for having a very engaging discussion.
Postwar.